Mark McNaris. I'm a professor of sociology here at the University of Texas. I also am president of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. And we're pleased to do another joint talk here between the SLEM Center and the Austin Institute. And we're happy to have Clara Piano, professor of economics at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee, with us. She's received her PhD in economics from George Mason. Primary areas of interest are family economics, thus a good fit with us. Law and economics, public choice. She's published academic papers in many topics, including mental health and marriage, Renaissance art contracts, it's different, organization of Christian seminaries, and Soviet family policy. Just the kind of public intellectual I like. Reads widely and writes widely. Work has been featured in outlets like Public Discourse and Faith and Economics podcast. Beyond economics, she enjoys reading and discussing Catholic social thought. I teach a class on Catholic social thought here to freshmen. I can't say I always enjoy reading it. Some of it's long, tedious, and not fun to read, but if she enjoys reading it, that's a credit to her. So she's talking about the fertility gap and economic freedom. Fertility gap is something that's been evident in demography for quite some time. So without further ado, Clara. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be in Austin today. It's my first time, so it's great to visit. And I'm just gonna quickly check that this isn't quite lining up, so that's okay. So today I'm going to discuss some really recent research that I have on the fertility gap and economic freedom. My co-author is Lyman Stone, so he's a demographer. So he's contributing some of the data, which we'll get into in a little bit. And I'm looking at fertility and the fertility gap from the economic perspective. And by recent research, I mean we were working on it earlier this week. So I'm really looking forward to any feedback that you'll have. My plan is to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and I'd love to open up for Q&A after and have a real discussion going because, again, like I said, this is a work in progress. I wanted to motivate this presentation by thinking about why economists would care about fertility to begin with. Economists are known for focusing on money, on inflation, unemployment, maybe law and econ contracts, things like that. But why is fertility really important from the economic perspective? And so to answer this question, just three main points. The first one is that people are the ultimate resource. I'm taking this phrase from Julian Simon, who's really a big hero of mine. He's an economist. As well, and he basically helped show the economics profession. I'll talk more about him in a second, but he basically did a lot of empirical work to show the economics profession that people and population growth is actually integral to economic growth, and that these two things are not at odds with each other inherently. And so people are the ultimate resource. It's really ideas which lead to technological progress, which then generates economic growth, right? It's not something about like capital, or it's not something about land ownership, right? It's really actually the human person. The fact that we don't have just hands to work and mouths to eat, he would say, but we actually have minds to think, right? To think of ways to do more with less, which is how we move forward as a society, increase standards of living. A really good example of this one I really like from the literature on immigration is the research that shows how not only do immigrants who move to a new country, they're more productive, more creative. They usually this is measured by how many patents they file. So they file more patents, right? They're really thinking ideas and able to see things in a new way, right? They're being in a new culture. But also the native population in the country receiving immigrants, we see upticks in patents and new businesses and things like that, right? Because there's also this interaction between people. So population growth is really cool and special from the economic perspective. It's as close to a free lunch as we get. in this sense, because it also introduces diversity, right? Because it's not a replication process, it's also a diversification process, which is important when we think about combining ideas in a new way. Recent Nobel laureate Paul Romer has also done a lot of work on this topic as well. The second point, more pragmatically speaking, we care about fertility because policymakers care about fertility. So a lot of, and actually I should say, firms and industries really rely on specific age structures. So I'm thinking of like here, Social Security is a great example, right? The program is designed with a specific dependency ratio, meaning a specific number of workers per retiree in mind. And so fertility changes, right? Especially if we have a situation like we have in China or Japan with declining populations. And most countries that we'll be talking about today, developed countries, are facing aging populations. This will have an impact on the types of industries that they're able to sustain. They're probably not going to be very labor intensive. Labor is becoming more scarce. And then also with this sort of social programs that you can sustain with that kind of tax base. So there's a pragmatic reason. And then I wanted to bring back in Simon. This is one of my favorite quotes, and it's from his magnum opus called The Ultimate Resource. And essentially, economists care about fertility and care about population growth because people do. And it's going to help us understand the world better if we understand, right, why people care about population growth and look at it from this more personal angle. And I think Simon's life's sort of career arc, his life story is a really good sort of narrative, or it's a good sort of almost a simple analogy of where the economics profession has moved. So maybe you've heard of Malthus before and neo-Malthusian ideas, right? The idea that population growth is dangerous and concerning in some ways. And basically what Simon did is when he first became an economist, he was advising USAID, so sort of international development programs through the federal government on how to promote contraceptive use in African countries specifically. And he was having a lot of trouble with it. Like people just didn't, he has a background in marketing as well. People just didn't want to like consume more contraception. And so he's going to present his findings, is pretty frustrated in Washington, D.C. one day. And he walks by the Vietnam Memorial and he has this epiphany. And he says, this is like his recollection of it. What business do I having to have trying to help arrange it that fewer human beings will be born, each one of whom might be a Mozart or a Michelangelo or an Einstein, or simply enjoy to his or her family and community a person who will enjoy life, right? So this idea that like there's obviously, we want to recognize an intrinsic value here as well when we're talking about fertility. And so then he devotes the rest of his life's work, and I really encourage you to check it out. Such a fan of this economist. To looking at empirically, like really studying rigorously how population growth does influence economic growth, right? Trying to understand that relationship. So now I want to just go over some recent trends. We're going to look globally first, and then we'll look more specifically at the United States, which is where our data draws from. So global fertility trends. This graph, it actually isn't showing at the bottom, but this is from the Institute for Family Studies, another great resource for a lot of studies like this. My co-author Lyman Stone is tracing out the average total fertility rate, which is like the basically expected fertility of the average reproductive age woman, and then contrasting this with the average fertility ideal. So we're starting to introduce the fertility gap here, which is basically the difference between ideals and actual achieved fertility. So there's specific surveys that have asked usually women, what fertility do you desire? How many children would you like to have? Would you ideally have? Sometimes it's worded, would you intend to have? I'm going to look at a few different measures of it in a few slides. But here they're asking, okay, what is your ideal fertility rate to women around the world? And economists always get super excited when we see trends cross, when we see like a crossing, like supply and demand, right? So here we see these lines are crossing in about 1995, and ever since, average fertility ideals have been above average total fertility, right? So even globally, right, there's a fertility gap, right? So women are not achieving their desired or ideal number of births. And so this is important when we start to look at why and dig in specifically to the countries where this gap is even larger, right? So here we see global fertility is still above replacement, right? It's above 2.1. Fertility ideals are also above replacement, right? But they're a little bit higher. That gap isn't huge though. We're gonna see here how it's gonna get bigger. So this is just the United States. These fertility trends we have, again, from my co-author. Let me just move this out of the way. So these are fertility preferences in the United States. Specifically, they're a little bit lower than the global averages. So we see that historically, and I apologize, the bottom of the graph is right here, 1960s, we have a goal of over 3 on average, more than 3 children in a family. And then this sort of slowly has a little bit decreased to in 2012 on this graph, it's 2.37. Some of the measures that we prefer, and I'll talk about why that is, we'll place that around like 2.46 today. So not a lot of change over time, and certainly above replacement. That's going to be sort of the key, is that there's, right, just the average woman really does, intend at least to have 2 children. All right, and then finally, this has become really important from a policy perspective. We're seeing a lot of countries, United States included, starting to think about, China included actually, which I wasn't even sure I would see in my lifetime, starting to think about how they can increase births, right? We can discuss maybe in the Q&A, like the incentives there for policymakers to increase fertility in their country. Obviously, national security is probably a pretty obvious one, but there are others. But over time, we've been seeing a huge uptick. This graph cuts off 2014. I promise you the trend continues. A huge uptick in countries introducing formal pro-family policy. Hungary is also a notable country here. They've just adjusted theirs. But basically, the idea is that policymakers are noticing what's going on with fertility, noticing declining fertility, things like that, and trying to respond with policy. And that also will play a role in the story that we're trying to tell. So I just want to recap what we went over just now with some fertility gap facts, just to sort of set the stage for our hypothesis and then our empirical analysis moving forward. So to formally define the fertility gap, it's the difference between desired or intended fertility and actual fertility. So just depending on the question wording, right? What is your ideal number of children? What is your desired number of children? Or what is your intended, right? What are your plans, right? So from an economist perspective, right, desires and ideals, this is like, you did have constraints, right? So you forget about your budget constraints and time constraints, right, maybe. But intentions, right, plans, this is probably taking into account your budget constraint, your time constraints, right, other sorts of obligations that you have. So the intentions gap tends to be smaller. I will show some data on that as well, than the desired gap, right? Desires are usually a little bit larger than our constraints. So first of all, just a fact, right? The fertility gap does not seem to be smaller in countries with more generous family policies. It's really quite the opposite. And obviously this is because countries that are worried about fertility are going to be implementing pro-family policies. But I note this because this hasn't moved much over time. So these policies have been around. We're just talking about the Soviet Union actually did introduce some policies intended to increase births towards the end of its sort of empire. But really these don't seem to have pushed the ball forward a lot. And so it's, at least from an economist perspective right now, there are a lot of papers being generated saying, okay, what are the effects of these policies? Do they actually increase births? Do they increase marriage rates, right? How can we better understand what actually policy can do, right, in this area? The fertility gap is, and actually I wanna also add that we're relatively fortunate in the United States. Compared to a lot of the countries we'll see the graph in a second, our fertility is remarkably high. And of course, right, we don't actually have very strong pro-family policy yet in this country. And so there is sort of this mismatch. This is definitely something that's going on more in Europe. Number two, one that I find most interesting, the fertility gap is largest for women in developed countries, so like high-income countries, who are highly educated. And this is super puzzling from just a sort of a pure, like a just sort of step one, right, economic perspective, because these are the women we would expect to have the most resources at their disposal to achieve their goals, right? To achieve the fertility that they desire or intend. This is confusing, right? Because of all women in the world, right, we would sort of expect these women to be the most powerful group, quite frankly. So why is their gap even larger than other women? And so there's some speculation on this that we'll get into. And then finally, number three, excess childlessness follows similar patterns. So we'll see a picture in a second. Excess childlessness is going to be the difference between the number of women who actually end up without having a child in their lifetime, minus the number of women who intended not to have children, right? Who said, yep, not for me, sort of thing. And so this is also a very similar pattern. So something is going on. I want to emphasize sort of like survey data. Economists are always very, very suspicious of survey data. We look at people do, not what they say. But this is a clue that something important is going on. It's not just that like people are having one child and then they're like, oof, not for me, too much work, right? And then changing their minds. Is that even women who don't even have a child, right, are still missing their fertility ideal. So there's something else going on. There's something definitely worth looking into. It's not just like oh, I changed my mind sort of thing. So I really like this graph, and I'm gonna scroll down so you can see the full sort of picture here. So this paper is actually what got me interested in the fertility gap in this research. The authors are at the top. We can go back if we need to, but they basically are the ones who are first documenting, okay, the women born in the 1970s, and they follow them throughout their reproductive years. Here's their fertility gap, like this cohort approach, and they're documenting the fertility gap is largest amongst these women who are highly educated. And so here's just their figure for excess childlessness. And it's sort of shocking, and you can see the countries with the largest excess childlessness gaps are towards the right. Greece, Germany, and Italy, Spain, and Austria, these countries will have about 20% excess childlessness, right? So it means even subtracting the number of women who intended, right, not to have children, right, saying, this is a choice I'm making, I know what I'm doing. 20% are ending up childless without intending to, right, without desiring this. So there's definitely something quite big going on in these countries, right? To have a 20% gap is quite large. And then of course it gets smaller as we go down this list. The United States is particularly, well off compared to the other countries here. But there's definitely something going on when we have excess childlessness rates like this. So we're going to approach the question of the fertility gap, and there is a large literature on it, and we're trying to contribute to it. We're going to bring in an institutional perspective. So this means basically looking at what are the rules of the game, sort of how economists think about institutions, right? What's the game that people are having to play here, and maybe are the rules of the game more conducive to fertility and narrower fertility gaps in certain areas? So just put simply, under which conditions is the fertility gap narrower, right? What are the conditions? Maybe there's something about the area, right? The jurisdiction that women are living in and experiencing that helps them either achieve their goals or not. So this is where I get to bring in economic freedom. So our hypothesis is that there is going to be this link between the fertility gap that we observe in our data and then economic freedom. And I'll talk about how we measure this in a second. But basically, recent work in family economics emphasizes, right, one of the conditions that's super important for understanding fertility choices is work-family compatibility. And specifically the term here that's used, and there's some of the work on this, which is great. The term here that's used that Golden specifically, I think, sort of coined is temporal flexibility. So this originally was discovered when economists were trying to answer why there's a gender wage gap, right? So, okay, we know the answer. It's like all of these variables we're controlling for them: education, industry, et cetera, experience. And then what's left over is this idea that women just tend, on average, to prefer jobs or types of work that allow for temporal flexibility, which means that you could choose which hours you work, perhaps choose your own schedule, right? Thinking gig work here, really, or just have some flexibility built into the day, right? If I need to, I can, drop everything and go pick up my sick child at school. Or if I need to, right, I can go take care of my elderly mother, or, there's a little bit more flexibility in these jobs. Of course, those are not the most high, right? These are not going to be the most high paying, working 90 hours a week types of jobs, right? That's where you get those big bucks, right? Because you're literally on call for people all the time. Your life is work. Women tend not to prefer those jobs. They tend to sacrifice pay for temporal flexibility. And so, okay, this tells us something, right, about the conditions under which women are more easily able to achieve fertility goals. Temporal flexibility is going to be important in the economy. And so the ability to plan also educational choices, right? Am I going to go to college now, later? What is that going to look like? What types of maybe vocational training do I need to get? Licensing work for the occupation that I'm choosing, right? Hairstylist, things like this. That will also play a role. And these types of constraints, right? So if we have like a rigid, there's a lot of regulation on gig work, there's a lot of occupational licensing, there's a lot of just sort of like union density, things like this. It's not a right to work state, it's another example. This is going to be especially important for women because we are relatively more time constrained when it comes to biology, right, for fertility. So you basically also want to pay attention to the fact that a lot of careers require upfront investment. And so those are your most fertile years, right? What is that calculus going to look like? And so more flexibility in a labor market, we think, is going to help, right, help this fertility gap. And just to put it right simply, economic freedom increases the degree of control that everyday people have over their lives. Right? Conceptually, that's what's going on. This is what we mean by economic freedom. And so now I want to get to how we would measure this, right? How are we going to measure something like economic freedom? So quite luckily, there are a few indices of economic freedom that have been produced. This, I believe, is the original one from the Fraser Institute. Honestly, like the Lord's work, these are economists who will go through laws, regulations, read just a bunch of this literature, policies, and then assign a score to a given jurisdiction. So states, provinces, your Canada, and then countries around the world will assign a score based on how economically free they are and with these specific measures in mind. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the average score of an individual state. So we're looking at the state level, which isn't perfect, but it's getting close. Of an individual state over the years 2000 to 2020. And the idea here is we want to capture as much of like a woman's working life and also just even like young life as possible. Because there's some literature that also shows, right, that your experience growing up in your home and maybe your mother's fertility as well, your peers' fertility will also impact your own fertility. So we're looking at sort of this experience of economic freedom enjoyed by the average woman during her reproductive years. So 2000 to 2020, taking the average. Also, this is going to help us sort of like churn out any COVID effects and some of the weird stuff that might have happened there. And so finally, we're going to be using this sub-national index. And so there are 3 areas in particular that this score is capturing. And we, one of the extensions of our project, and I can talk more about this at the end, is we're trying to see which sub-area is actually the most important, right, in our data. So government spending is measured by this index, and that basically is like a proportion of, like, I think per capita GDP, like how much does the government spend in this jurisdiction? How active are they? Like the percentage of public employees in the state. Taxation, looking at property tax rates, whether or not they have income taxes, other types of taxes that the state levy, and then finally labor market freedom. So regulations, union density, minimum wage laws, the share of the population actually working in minimum wage, right? So trying to get at this idea of, like, okay, how much control, right, do people have over their economic decisions? So we're combining this data, this economic freedom score from the Fraser Institute, with a new fertility preferences survey. I think this data is super cool. Thanks to my co-author Lyman for this. And it's an online survey of reproductive age women in the United States. We're using, I think, 4 waves, and we'll probably get to add some in the next couple of months. But right now we're at about 13,000 responses, and we're aggregating those to the state level. So I'll show you a graph in a little bit with the individual level responses. Right now we don't have enough to cover each state with a large enough sample. So we're keeping it aggregated. And the particular measure that we want to use to think about the fertility gap is going to be called our weighted happiest measure. And so this is a question that I think Lyman himself designed, and I love it because there's a great economic intuition behind it. It's actually capturing more of what sort of actually goes on when you like plan a family than some of these more like cut and dry questions. So basically, he has respondents report how happy they would be across family outcomes of 0 to 6, right? So sometimes, right, you'll have like surprise fertility, or like it's a little hit and miss sometimes, right? It's not, no one's like in perfect control, right, of this process. And so we're trying to understand, right, how marginally people are valuing different family outcomes, right? So, okay, 3 is my ideal, but maybe I wouldn't be too upset, right? If it was 4, or if it was maybe 2, I'd be really upset, right? I wanted, sort of capturing some of this degree of variation, this gradation. So it's a really rich measure. We discussed in the paper, right? It's actually very stable across time. It has a lot of like neat properties. So we really like this measure. And so we're going to use this then as weights. We're going to use the happiness scores as weights to assign that weighted happiest parity outcome. So it's basically just like on average, right? What is the number of children that this woman would be happiest with? It's going to be a weird decimal, right? 2.4 children, right, would be your ideal like happiness. But again, we like it for those various reasons. And then we'll subtract the total fertility rate, where we'll subtract that from the total fertility rate, which again is going to give us a good measure of what actual fertility is expected to be for these women. The individual data we'll look at actually shows completed fertility. So we know that like this was their completed fertility. And then finally, we need some control. Right? So finally, we're going to try to control for a lot of things that the literature has identified as important for fertility. And we want to show, and I feel strongly about this, that even controlling for these big influences on fertility decisions or big predictors of fertility, economic freedom still matters, right? There's still something that we're trying to capture with this like work-family balance and the like. So we're going to control for the share of married households, because research has shown that marital fertility impacts population level fertility quite strongly. And so controlling for married households, the share of married households, controlling for median household income. So there's some really interesting recent research that shows that this long-standing relationship thought to be negative between income and fertility, right? As people get wealthier, as countries get wealthier, they lower their fertility, right? We focus on quality, maybe of children, like education, investing in fewer children. This long-standing relationship is so exciting. This research like just came out like this past year, actually is flipped now. And so fertility is actually, in some cases, positively associated, certainly not negatively associated. In some cases, it has no association, but has a new relationship to income since like 1980 is really what some of these papers are showing. And the idea here is that what's happened is that actually the opportunity cost of children from a wage earning perspective has gone down with the marketization, or just like the fact that you can actually outsource a lot of the cost of children. You have sort of free public education, free public education. You have childcare. You have very convenient food, cheap. Never been cheaper to clothe your children. Clothing prices are very low relative to average wages, and other types of things like this. So where we actually see housing is a little bit of an issue, and we can definitely talk about that in Q&A. But basically, what some people are finding in the data is that this negative relationship no longer holds. Because of this, though, we're just going to try to control for fertility, right? So I'll show in a second what we find with the relationship between income and the fertility gap, but that's really interesting. And I should also say that we wanted to extract the income enhancing effects of economic freedom, because it is a very strong finding in the literature on economic freedom, that economic freedom is associated with higher incomes. We want to control for religiosity. And since our data is going to be actually collected during COVID, so our numbers are 2020 to 2022, we decided not to do attendance rates, right? Like, do you go weekly to a religious service or monthly? I do have another version of robustness check where we do this, and the results are pretty similar. But the religiously unaffiliated share, we thought, is just a better measure of, okay, like, here's the share of the population that's just not like super religious, right? So they're not going to be motivated, in religious terms in their fertility. And then finally, the share of foreign born. There is a great relation, or a really interesting relationship between like immigration and fertility, where not only do immigrants or the foreign born populations, they're more likely to have higher fertility like that of their home country, generally higher than the United States. But also we see in cities where there's a large influx of immigrants, actually highly educated women increase their fertility in response. And the mechanism here is thought to be something like immigrants actually make childcare or schools, things like this, more affordable. And so you're able to outsource, again, some of the work of children, some of that cost. That might be very high time cost, right? If you're a highly educated, like high earning woman, you can outsource some of that with childcare, which is now much more affordable if you have more labor, and so that should influence fertility. So we're controlling for those effects as well. So not quite at the results yet. I'm going to force you to look at some summary statistics and a few graphs first. So we have our weighted happiest gap. So this is that weighted happiest measure minus total fertility, which I believe on average is 1.69 over 2020 to 2022. And so we see our observations N is 50, right? So we're using the 50 states. We see the narrowest weighted happiest gap, fertility gap, is 0.3. It's 0.3, so 0.3 children, right? So it's not, it's positive in every single state. So in no state is the average woman achieving her fertility desires, or her average, like her happiest outcome. So that's interesting to note. The median is 0.8, so almost one child, right? So women on average are about like one child off of their weighted happiest number of children. The maximum gap is 1.4. We'll have a map of the United States where we can see this geographically, so we can see where Texas is. Fertility intentions. So we want to also look at, this is one of our robustness checks, Does the fertility intentions gap, so not measuring desires, but just trying to get actual fertility plans that might take into account some budget constraints, et cetera. Is there still a gap? Yes, there's still a positive gap. Very, very small though, so 0.4 is the minimum. Median is about a third of the child, 0.3 children. And then the maximum is 0.7. So still, most women are not even having the number of children that they originally planned to have. Economic freedom scores also have this nice variation. So we see the lowest economic freedom, I believe this is New York State, this is 4.1, right? So pretty rigid, a lot of taxes, right? Thinking just like, I always picture it as a rocky, it's not very dynamic. The median score is 6.1 and then the maximum is 7.7. So some nice variation in there with economic freedom across the states. If any of you have been paying attention to migration patterns during COVID, you probably have an intuition about economic freedom in the states as well, right? So people are leaving California, right? Settling at better states and invading Nashville where I live, basically. I love it. So median household income, we have ranging from 46,000, this might be Mississippi, I'm not sure. Median is 62,000, and then a maximum of 87. Married household share, so 46, 52, 61, again, nice variation. Religiously unaffiliated, we'll see 15% of the population up to 40%. And then the foreign-born share is all the way down at 1.6 and then up to 26.6. And so those are the summary statistics. So let's look at a picture of what fertility desires using our preferred measure, this weighted happiest measure, looks like across the United States. You can see here, the darker it is, the more intensely or the more children women are desiring in these states. So you'll see actually Alaska is a pretty high, looks like over 2.7 children on average women would be happiest with there. North Dakota, Maine, Utah, and then actually, sort of where you would expect, right, the South, the Midwest, we're seeing these darker colors. Vermont is particularly uninterested in having, a lot of kids. An interesting outlier. I think maybe the coloring needs to look a little sharper. Hawaii is also on the lower end of this, but I want to point out to every single, and I'll scroll down here to show, every single state using this measure has fertility desires that are well above replacement, right? Well above 2.1. So then let's look at economic freedom across the states. And this has a little bit more of a clear pattern to it, maybe with what we know about the different regions in the United States. We have more economic freedom in the South, maybe Midwest, Texas, Florida, right, Tennessee. These are pretty strong, pretty economically free states. New York's not doing so hot, right? Alaska, California, they're struggling a little bit more. So our raw correlations, I think this is super, I was very excited about this. So let me adjust the screen a little bit. So we have our economic freedom score on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is two different measures, so we're stacking two correlation plots on top of each other. We have fertility desires at the bottom, and then total fertility rate at the top. So we see here, we can tell, okay, because the fertility gap measure is basically two statistics in one. It's measuring the difference between total fertility rates and fertility desires. And so I wanted to see, is it that economic freedom, what does it have the most impact on? Which of these? And so we can see here that economic freedom actually has a pretty strong positive, I think it's 0.46 or something, pretty strong positive correlation with the total fertility rate. And I'll show you some more data on this soon. And it's weekly, very small, maybe negative on fertility desires. So it looks like, women in economically free states are more likely to have higher fertility, and that this doesn't actually impact their fertility desires so much, right? As we would, probably expect, right? It's not one of those big ones, marriage, religion, etc., right? That's going to really impact our fertility preferences, but that it has a strong impact on fertility. So here are our main results, our main table, and actually I want to get that R squared in there. So our dependent variable is a weighted happiest gap, and right. So again, this measure of on average, like how many children would this woman be happiest having? And so our raw association is in column 1. We have economic freedom is predicting statistically significantly, so a narrower gap, and so to the tune of 0.058, which is telling us that a 1-point increase in your economic freedom score will reduce your fertility gap, right, by this amount. And I'll talk about the economic sort of like significance of this in the next slide. I'll interpret it a little bit more, but that's a pretty economically significant amount for this measure. This does change ever so slightly, hardly at all, when we control for median household income to try to pull out those income effects on fertility. And we see that actually controlling for economic freedom, income does have this positive effect on the fertility gap. So it widens the fertility gap across the states in our data. And that small circle is showing it's significant at the 20% level. We have a super small sample, so I just wanted to include some more levels. And then finally, column 3, we have just a slight reduction in the magnitude of our coefficient, but it's still significant at the 10% level. And we can see that even controlling for sort of marriage, religiosity, and immigrants with our measures, we still have this negative impact, this narrowing of the fertility gap when you have economic freedom, more economic freedom in your state. And so just to point out, so our observations are 50. Our R-squareds are not massive, right? So we're not saying a huge amount of the variation in the data, in the fertility gap data. But because we actually have a reduction in our R-squared with the third column, we're adding a lot of variables, and it's actually not giving us a lot of explanatory power to gain. We sort of prefer column 2. We think this is telling us a lot. This has the highest R-squared, explaining the most variation. So just to conclude, right, what are the implications? So a 1-point increase in the economic freedom score of a state is associated with and I'm just rounding down here, a 0.05 decrease in the fertility gap, which is about a 6%, more than a 6% reduction in the average fertility gap. So that's actually substantial. That's actually really substantial. So to put it in perspective, California at 4.58 for their economic freedom score enjoyed the same degree of economic freedom as Texas, which is at 7.43. So it's almost like a 3-point increase. We're looking at a predicted fertility gap that's smaller by 0.16 children, right? So this is significant because it means that now almost 2 out of every 10 women who would not be achieving their fertility goals now are, right? Because of this change. That's the prediction of our model. We have some individual level results. I mentioned this, right? We're looking at completed actual fertility. So these are women aged 40 to 44, and we do see this positive association between economic freedom score and the fertility gap, where the fertility gap is lower the higher the economic freedom. And then this is just to sort of kick off a Q&A. We have some extensions, some questions that we'd like to further investigate. Which component of economic freedom, such a big measure, is the most important? Are we going to be looking at the taxation, labor market regulations, or government spending, which is most conducive to a narrower gap? We have some suggestive evidence that I can maybe talk about in the Q&A that I'm still puzzling over. Is there some omitted variable? Always want to account for omitted variable bias, right? That is causing both economic freedom and fertility in particular to rise. And then finally, can economic freedom explain why pro-family policy is generally ineffectual, right? We haven't actually seen these great results. A lot of countries are trying to give tax incentives, right? Maybe child tax credits, et cetera, to having children, but there's not necessarily a lot of bang for your buck. Well, this looks like maybe this is a cheap option, right, for increasing fertility. So basically, I will conclude there, right? Fertility desires are above replacement, fertility actually is below. So this is a really interesting, we think, avenue for future research. So thank you so much for listening. I hope I didn't talk your ears off too much, but are there any questions? It's very convincing. Good.
I just have a question about the participants and the fertility preferences for. So those are women that are married or who are?
Yeah, no, good question. I should have mentioned this a little bit more. So,
Go back, let's sort of data slide.
yeah, let's go back to the data slide. So these are women. These are only women, and previous research gives us reason to think that this is actually understating the true gap, because when men and women are asked about fertility preferences, actually men tend to be a little bit higher, probably for obvious reasons. They're not bearing as much of the cost of fertility. And so we probably are understating the true gap. But this is not just married women. So this includes all women. And it measures reproductive age women, so age 15 through 44. In the United States, it's an online survey that my co-author put together himself. The firm that's funding it is called Demographic Intelligence. If you want to go look, they have a bunch of other research with this particular survey as well.
And so you create a state level average of these things, right?
Yeah, so we're going to aggregate the responses.
There's a lot of things I'm thinking of predicting individual variation in response based on these state level variables, which is fine, but you're not doing that. I mean, it became obvious to me.
Yeah, we are trying to find different robustness checks. So we're going to use individual level and like state fixed effects and things like that, but we don't want that to be our main, right? What we're trying to do ideally is you want a panel data set, right? You want like 150 observations if we can get, each state over time. So that's what we're hoping to gather, I think, in the next waves.
How long did it take you 13,000?
I don't actually know. I think 2 years.
You're doing panels.
I think 2 years. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what they've been running it. They're on the 6th wave right now, I understand.
Is it possible to do a finer level of aggregation of the data?
So that's a good question. I haven't asked my co-author because the issue is that economic freedom scores don't go to a lower jurisdiction. Obviously, ideally, like county level would be really interesting to look at, because that's probably more relevant in terms of like lived experiences. If we're thinking about something like, even like, I think pure effects would be really interesting. Religiosity at that level might be a little bit more important. But yeah, unfortunately, economic freedom, the lowest it goes, my understanding, and maybe I think they do the top of 10 cities, but is the state level. But we are also looking, so the Mercatus Center at George Mason has a great resource of regulation, like just regulatory policy across the states, and I believe they might get a little bit more fine-tuned. And so we're going to look at like things like housing and other things that aren't necessarily captured in this economic freedom index.
Would you use that as an additional control, or would it be part of the economic freedom?
Be more of an extension. So we're going to sort of use these main results as like a springboard and then say like, okay, we see this, but like, what is economic freedom standing for? Like, it's not like economic freedom itself is like we're trying to understand the causal mechanism, right? If there is a causal mechanism, right? Is it a proxy? I should actually add, we thought maybe it's a proxy for like conservatism or like, the traditionalism. And so we did have some results where we tried to control for like the share that voted for Trump in 2016, and we still actually find that economic freedom matters. So it's capturing something, and we think maybe it's capturing one explanation is that it's lowering the cost of having children from an economic perspective. If people are doing more of it, the cost is lower, and maybe this has something to do with housing regulation as well. Because one of the main costs there.
Trump vote as a state level variable, but you didn't go to the model, wasn't.
No, we didn't. We decided to go with the unaffiliated share for religiosity, and like we decided to stick with the ones that are shown in the data to actually be influencing fertility systems, like religion, like marriage, and things like that. But yeah, maybe that is interesting to include in like an appendix table to show that. Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. The second one kind of relates on the first one. Economic freedom, simply defined, how is that? What is that?
Yep, it's the degree of control that the everyday person has over their economic decisions, essentially.
Okay, then the second question, how does things like IVF and other sorts of fertility programs or operations, or however, I don't know if they're probably defined as, but how does that correlate? What correlation is there? And what does that look like, or what does that measure?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting angle, one that we've been thinking a lot about. We don't have good measures, and I'm not even sure if you could ever get this data of like IVF like usage at the state level. Although it's becoming more common, we don't expect it to explain, like it's not a huge share, right, of births right now at least, and so we're not expecting it to play a large role. What we do find though, and this is a spin-up paper that we're probably going to do because it's just like a different route, a different sort of angle on the fertility gap. We find that, and this is so shocking to me, but apparently it's well known in like demography, maybe in sociology as well, that contraceptive access increases the fertility gap. So we're thinking like, okay, so like I wanted to understand like, okay, contraception, and then we have a data set for like abortion, and then like things like adoption, and like ideally like IVF, right? Other influences on fertility. And the biggest, most significant thing is that contraceptive access is increasing that fertility gap. And from like an economist perspective, silly old me, I was like, makes no sense, right? That should be people closer to their fertility goals, presumably. But I was told like, there's like irrational usage apparently of contraceptives that's increasing the gap. Irrational usage, yeah.
Define that.
Yeah, it's definitely not. Yeah, it's irrational in a sense. This is just an example Lyman was giving me. Is like, well, someone says, right, they want to have 3 children and they have 90, and you know they're not taking actions, right? So it's what we're concerned about as economists, which is that survey data is what people say, and it's not what they, you know, where they put their money where their mouth is type of thing. And so that is a spin-off I think we need to do, right, to be more honest, like, hey, here's what's actually going on, right? Are people doing anything themselves, right, to solve their own fertility gaps? You know, sort of. It's
also indicative of how people have lots of competing, contradictory preferences and desires. You know?
For sure, yeah. You know, is it fear? I know actually. I joke in my friends. There's a lot of econ moms. We like this like chat, right? And Emily Oster is an economist who's given a lot of data to mothers in particular, basically showing that a lot of these fears about like pregnancy, like, oh, you need to wrap yourself in bubble wrap, like, you know, don't eat anything, like, because it could be contaminated, are really overblown, right? And so I think, you know, there's definitely maybe a fear component, like, oh, I'd love to have this number of children, like ideally, but like, you know, there's obviously other factors at play. What I'm also interested in too is that the marriage market has, like, again, this ties in with your research, right? It's also difficult probably to find that matching, right? So you can't just produce, right? IVF sort of excluded and other types of things, but like.
Who's talking to you? It's 13,000. Who are they?
These are women, reproductive age women, online survey, everything, whole gamut. 15 to 44.
So like mimicking the NSFG.
Yes, and so we're taking some of the question wordings are from like the THS and the NSFG and some of the other more general social surveys, some of the other more main instruments.
Yeah, I can imagine that in the upper 20s and early 30s, like, if their marriage experiences were not working out well, then there's a tendency to sort of reframe your autobiography and what you believe you want to reflect your current situation. So, you know,
Interesting.
that can affect how people would answer in the first place.
Yeah, so what's really interesting, so that sort of speaks to like the importance of using more of a cohort-based approach, right? So following like the actual individual women and then comparing what they say. Although, you know, this is what the previous speaker did, asking women when they're 20 to 24, how many children, you know, do you intend to have? And then seeing how many they actually have when they're 44, presumably done. And then that is the gap, right? That's probably like the better measure of something like a gap. Awesome. All right.
Can you go to the last slide?
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm scrolling. I'm not sure why the extension concluding thoughts.
No,
The extensions.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The question you're after doesn't hit at like legislators' levels, right? A, they don't know the data about what people want, and they're much more attuned to sort of what they think people ought to want in some ways.
So that's what I like about the fertility gap is that you can make an argument like this isn't about optimal population size, which is like can get sort of gross like, pretty quickly. This is more about like what are women achieving their own fertility goals, right? But you're right that this isn't necessarily a policy paper.
Yeah. So early on when you talk, from that first or second slide on close programs depend on specific age structures, absolutely, and everybody can get that, including the politicians. So economically, or social psychological, why don't politicians care? Or is it because they think, with some reason, that there's nothing they can fundamentally do about it, which is not true. And even more importantly, like, why don't businesses care, right? Why don't, like, if you think about sort of they should be interested in economic freedom in general, most businesses are. But, you know, I have to say that there are plenty of businesses that, for their own employees, roll out the red carpet for things that basically limit family size, right? And almost guarantee limit team family size, including like expectations of long-term hours, etc. That's not a long-term strategy. But now, how many businesses actually have long-term strategies? I don't know.
Yeah, so no, that's a really good point. And from, you know, cynical economists over here, like it makes sense, right? Why companies are like, yes, we'll pay, you know, for an abortion or something like this. And we're not necessarily going to, you know, want higher fertility amongst the women that we employ because we're just getting less bang for our buck, right? We're getting fewer working hours for women. But the time horizon of businesses is also probably shorter than policymakers, right? The average like business is only like around for like 50 to 100 years, if that. And so
it's a long time horizon to not care.
Well, I should say actually the decision makers in business, right? The CEO or something like that. But also, I think from, you know, thinking about policy and policy relevance and like economic freedom, I think there's not necessarily an understanding, and this is something that we try to emphasize in the paper, that like something like your housing regulation could actually be an anti-natal policy because you're making children more expensive. Or one of my favorite examples, this is super interesting. There's a study that showed that car seat regulation, basically making it's called, the paper is called Car Seats as Contraception. Basically making parents keep children in car seats for a long time, that they have to be very big and like protective, overly protective actually. If you like look at the crash data, that actually increases the cost of the third child because you have to get a new car to fit all of those car seats in the back. and that this actually like prevented like X number of births, right? This huge cost of having a third kid versus just a second. So things like this, you know, it's classic unintended consequences, right? It's like, you know, I want to solve a problem, but like there's these ripple effects, right, for family decisions. And like family is so fragile in a lot of ways. So right, paying attention to like what sort of incentives are actually being presented, right, to parents. Or an example I give in my class, there was a plane crash a while ago where some infants unfortunately passed away because, or where most of the passengers had passed away because they were in their mother's arms. And the idea was, let's pass regulation to have car seats in all planes and force women to buy tickets. And economists like signed this huge petition, like, no, don't do this. We've done the math, like we sort of like, you know, foresee that driving in cars is so much more dangerous, right, than the probability of a car crash, and people are just going to substitute. So, yeah, the policy implications, you're right. Maybe it'd be nice to sharpen this a little more.
And yeah, lots of pro-family policies are ineffectual, right? I mean, I think about the incentivization of different countries. So far, it seems very mediocre, right, with tons of bucks, right? And you know, Poland as an example, you know, they moved their policy from 500 zloty per month for a second child and higher down to a first child. But why do they do it? So far as I can tell, it's a sheerly political move because people liked it and like, okay, it's kind of vote buying for the next election. Even though like paying people to have the first child doesn't make sense to me. It's paying for the third and above, really, right?
It's tricky. It's definitely tricky because what are you also incentivizing when you start paying, right, people to have kids? Like the Soviet Union actually did try this at the end, and they had like dormitories for single mothers, quite literally like intended to like have them have a lot of children and then leave them into like work.
I think they don't.
I mean, they
today
you know,
sort of, you know, coupons and discounts on subways and things like that. It just doesn't resonate. Like people want money.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, you can spend it on what you need and things like that. It's more fungible. I think Hungary is an example of where some of their pro-family policies were basically giving women tax-free income for life if you have like 4 children.
So they get tax-free income, or they
Right.
have to pay taxes?
They don't have to pay taxes on their earned income, which of course is incentivizing mothers to stay in the labor force.
Correct.
And it's going to have these weird impacts probably on inter-family, like bargaining, allocation, specialization, et cetera. So, yeah. So Lymanster, my co-author, we were talking about earlier, he has an interesting blog article on Georgia's family policy. This is probably the only one I would give at this point, which is more of a religious approach, right? The benefits aren't monetary from what I can understand. It's basically you have higher status, like with having your child baptized by the head of the church, I think. So something like this, or thinking creatively, like economic freedom, religious freedom is another, I think, interesting exploration for future study. Like, what are the impacts of this on fertility?
I just want to try and understand, but not starting with the fertility gap. So, are you reconsidering one woman trying at 44 inches through her childbearing period? How that affected the number of kids, or is it just like early on goals in the conversation?
Just early on for the cohort study. So for our survey, it's just asking women, no matter at what point in their childbearing like careers they are, how many children they would ideally like to have. So if they already have, like, let's say they have like 3 kids, super happy with 3, and they know they're basically done. Like, you rank 3 as your happiest outcome, and then like 0s for the rest. So we're trying to capture, right, like some of that, right? Like, okay, like I've achieved it or something, I'm happy with this. And so to allow, it's not just thinking about like 20-year-olds, right? And I understand why you look at women, you know, in their 20s, when you're thinking about marriage, you're thinking about your careers, you're starting to plan, you're probably almost done with your education. So you definitely would want to ask any sooner. You're probably a little bit aware of like the costs, right, of fertility and things like this, the benefits too, right, hopefully. But yeah, there's no follow-up like exit survey would be like, nice to see. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, what are some of the other like causal pathways? Like things that I'm thinking about, women are having children later in life, and so there's decreased fertility just by that like aspect of greater economic freedom. There's more opportunity to be involved in the workforce, but then you're putting these decisions off to children.
Yeah.
What other hypothesizes? I guess, and what data would you be able to collect to be able to tease out that type of effect versus general economic?
Yeah, like delayed fertility because of like career investment, which is obviously happening, right? So Claudia Golden is really good on this. Her new book, Career and Family, gets really deep into this. She talks about like 5 cohorts of women, and like basically today, women are trying to combine both at the same time, whereas like the previous generation is one and then the other, but then they realize, oh, you know, darn, I'm 40, I'm not going to reach my fertility goals, right? And so she's very optimistic about like remote work. That's like, and a lot of these economists are as well, right? This is what can be really beneficial for women to have sort of the balance that they desire. And so that might be something that we're like considering looking at, like the share of remote workers. If we can get that data, I'd be really interested to see gig economy regulations. I think will be important. California is particularly poor on those, and so I think that there's good evidence that women are disproportionately benefited from gig work. There's another stream of literature though that I didn't necessarily bring up in the paper that talks about how stable, just a stable job, a stable income is also conducive to fertility. So this is Sarah who does some of this work and showing like just the more like just basically, you know, I know what I'm doing right every day. That can also be helpful, right, for raising children and combining those two things. So yeah, I'm trying to think of there's one other thing I was gonna say in response to that.
Well, it kind of sounds like it's related to the trend that was used to me, right? Like that as countries get wealthier, the fertility goes down, right? But then there's also this kind of other effect that within, my perception is like within wealthy countries, that the wealthier countries or the greater wealth or greater median household income is correlated with the greater fertility. Was that
like it's U-shaped. Yeah. So the U-shape makes it weird correlation-wise, of course. But I think that is correct. The paper I'm specifically referencing is called New Fertility Facts by Dubka. I think I have it, and his co-authors, there's a couple of them. It's 2022. And basically what they show is like this relationship no longer like holds across most countries and within most countries. Where it was very clear, like negative relationship, and now it's like definitely U-shaped for within a lot of countries. And so from an economist perspective, like this is sort of okay, right? Obviously we've seen a growth in like the service economy, right? There's something else going on here that all of a sudden is allowing people to spend that income, right, on something that they clearly desire, which is children, fertility. But it's that middle class, like that's actually missing out on the fertility achievement. Yeah.
Are there any trends in what we've been hearing of the men, NONES, having an increase in showing an increase of intended pregnancy, almost as a form of religiosity, because they're like trying to reach the next generation and like they have this like fundamental like anti-religious view, so they're like trying to have more children into that ideology.
So no, that's really interesting. I don't know a lot about the literature on the rise of the nuns, but it's definitely, I know some literature on the economics of religion, and there certainly are religious groups that their strategy, right, is fertility, and this makes sense, like evolutionary, like you would want to, you know, religious groups that don't have that strategy don't exist anymore, right? They died out, right? You're all celibate.
Qualitative experience that process where they're like, we're intending to have more children, I almost wonder if it's to like pass on that ideology to that generation.
That's really interesting. It's certainly possible, right, as a strategy, right, for group survival. I do know just a lot of people who tend to be like close to the data usually have like higher fertility. I'd be interested to see like across like departments in colleges and universities. Like economists, I think particularly have higher fertility, and it's, I think they don't worry as much, like they know the data, like, okay, I can't really impact them so much either way, right? So I'm not super worried about raising kids, but it'd be really interesting to see.
And does higher fertility necessarily correlate with actual intended pregnancy? Because, you know, for the longest time, like, I'm sure we've all seen that movie Idiocracy, like, where it's like, you know, there would be generations that were just like waiting to have children, like you were mentioning, and so then as they got older, their fertility would decrease, and so there would be, you know, not many children, but during that time, during their fertility years, their fertility was high. So it's a higher than that socioeconomic status, but the fertility or the intended pregnancies are lower than what we would expect, even though they had high fertility rates.
So like, so it's my understanding that unplanned pregnancies are like down, have been going down for a while. Like teenage pregnancies are certainly, from what I understand, definitely going down. Like, yeah. The idea, I mean, there's like a lot of technology, obviously, that's allowing like greater fertility control to an extent. But that in general, most births are like intended. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think that's about it. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to speak with all of you. And if you ever want to ask questions, that makes me great here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.